everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, The Capital Crime of Witchcraft, What Primary Sources Tell Us, presented by Margo Burns. Thank you all so much for coming.
Not quite. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. A dozen. Yay!
We are grateful to New Hampshire Humanities for supporting this event and want to thank you for attending. New Hampshire Humanities is an independent nonprofit. Its work is statewide, but it is not a state agency. New Hampshire Humanities grants and programs support local organizations like this one. Each year, New Hampshire Humanities has sponsored more than 700 educational and cultural programs each year all over the state. Evaluations have been placed near you. At the end of the event, please be sure to add your comments on them and include your name and contact information if you'd like to be added to their mailing list. If you are interested, I'm happy to connect you with New Hampshire Humanities staff if you have more questions, suggestions, or ideas. Now, let me introduce tonight's speaker. Margo Burns is the project manager and associate editor of records of the Salem Witch Hunt, published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press, the definitive collection of transcriptions of the legal records of this episode. Burns has appeared in a variety of documentaries, symposiums, and presentations about the trials. She is also the great times 10 granddaughter of Rebecca Nurse, who was hanged in 1692. She is a 7th generation New Hampshire native with 2 master's degrees from the University of New Hampshire. She works at St. Paul's School in Concord as the director of the Language Center. She is currently working on a biography of William Stoughton, Chief Magistrate of the Salem Witch Trials, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Margo Burns.
Thank you very much. Isn't it nice to be out? Yeah. Yes, I last year I didn't give any talks, and I've missed them greatly. So thank you so much for coming out. Tonight I'm going to be talking about this, but you can ask questions. I'm perfectly fine to ask questions. Because they're recording it, if you ask me a question, I'm going to repeat the question before I answer it. So if anybody's in the live stream or anybody sees something later, they won't go, what was that question? Now this is the title. I didn't give this title. The Humanities Council gave it this title because this was mine. Yeah, they said, that might not go so well. That's okay. But basically, we know that they hanged witches in Salem. What did it take to do that? And I'll tell you, paperwork. I mean, they left a trail of everything that they did. So to get started, I'm going to set us in time and place. We'll go to place first. This is a map from 1665. And it's a Belgian map, and you sort of look at it and go, well, there's Cape Cod. Easy. Long Island. Looking a little fatter than I think it is. Mm-hmm. Here are our main rivers. We got the Hudson, the Connecticut, the Merrimack. So you recognize it. We're going to look at just that one section up there for now. So it all really does map to what we have today. So this is the exact coastline that's in this one. Looks a little different, I know. So you can see Salem and Boston, and Great Bay, which they clearly thought was greater than we think of it today. Wasn't there a lot of oystering or something? Oh yeah, yeah. So, but one of the things about this older map is that a lot of the travel at the time was done along the water. So all of the seacoasts and the bays and things like that, and as people were on ships, they wanted to know where they were. So that's why there's a lot more detail there. So this is what it looks like now. Now, at one point I said Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. No, Vermont. I spent the summer in Vermont. But Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. And at one point, all of this was Massachusetts. But you look at the fine detail of all the different towns. This is what it looked like in 1692. Much bigger towns. And if you know your town history, you'll see how things were carved up in one town. Well, that used to be part of Exeter. This used to be part of that. So these are our basic towns. Now, if you know anything about how the Salem witchcraft trial started, you'll know that there were some accusations in Salem Village. And this is just inland on Salem in Massachusetts. And the basic story is that the minister in town, his daughter and niece, started exhibiting strange things. They were running around and screaming and things like that. He was trying to figure out what to do. The local doctor, Dr. Griggs, basically said, I've tried everything, might be witchcraft. Oh, then you go down that spiral. But that's where most of the cases you may already know about took place. If you've heard about the two little girls, when you're remembering things, you got maybe 5 slots to remember, maybe 7. But the two little girls, they'll fill up 1 slot. We got the afflicted girls. Then they accused people. They accused 3 women, actually, 2 of them named Sarah, that's another slot, right? And Tituba, who was an Indian. So she gets her own little slot because she's marked for race and social caste. Then, of course, we got the father and minister all in one, so we put Samuel Parris in that. And then we get John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who were the local magistrates who came. Well, they're both Johns. Let's give them just 1. So already you have the story in 5 slots. The afflicted girls, the people that they accused, the minister and father, and the judges. And that you could basically tell a story from that. But those are just the beginning. Just the beginning. Because there's other stuff going on. As a matter of fact, all of Salem, people started accusing other people in all of Salem. And in Chelmsford and in Ipswich. In Chelmsford, a little bit before the Salem trial started, about 4 or 5 months before, a woman named Martha Sparks was accused in Chelmsford. Chelmsford, did I get that right? And she was in jail. She was in jail in Boston for the entire time of the Salem witchcraft trials. We don't hear anything else about her except that she was sent to prison, and we find out when she was freed. We don't hear anything about her case. But that took place in October before the things started happening in March of 1692. So she was sitting there in jail waiting and was there the whole time. In Ipswich, there was another case going on with Rachel Clinton, who was being accused by a completely different group of people, right around the same time the Salem cases were taking off. So it wasn't just this one little place in Salem Village. It was being surrounded by other things. It was popping up, and people were very sensitive to it. We know the story about the little girls and Samuel Parris because it's really compelling. Again, you get the 5 things. And if you have those 2 extra slots in your memory for something, it's usually you remember that guy who got crushed by stones because it's gruesome, Giles Corey, or you have an ancestor, mine's Rebecca Nurse, or you really like The Crucible by Arthur Miller, and you know about those particular Abigail Williams and John Proctor. So you might know some of those other ones, but we've got the basic story. Before we're through, there are accusations in all those towns, all the way up to Wells, Maine. We've got, up here we've got an attack on York just before the things were going on. So there was a nervousness about the indigenous people attacking. It depends on which side of it you're going to be on. You can call it the Candlemas Massacre. That's what the English folks called it. But it's basically, it was a raid on York. And they killed about 100 people, took another 80 hostage, took them up in January, Candlemas, January 25th, took them up to Quebec. I'm thinking, that's quite a trip in the middle of winter. But this is the range of it. You'll notice that Hampton's kind of empty on that one. That's because they had their own accusations in 1680, and they were just pretty much done with it. So, okay, so that gives us geography. Let's go to time. So remember our friend Martha Sparks? Martha Sparks, October of 1691. She's in there the whole time. We start getting the accusations on February 29th. It was a leap year. And then they started accusing more and more people. In addition to the 2 little girls, some of the teenagers, the maidservants were starting to make accusations. Adult people were starting to make accusations. We know mostly about those screaming girls. I have a little cartoon that I made. Every single documentary on Salem, they're always the screaming girls, you know. Yeah, why do we concentrate on them? I'm more interested in the men who are actually writing down these complaints and making these decisions. But I don't know, there's something very compelling about the screaming girls. She's afflicting me. And they were claiming that their spirits, the spirits of these people, were coming invisibly to them and hurting them. So when they arrested Rebecca Nurse, there she is up front, not doing anything except protesting her innocence. And these girls would start falling on the floor and say, oh, Goody Nurse is choking me, she's pinching me, she's almost killing me. And it's like, what? But they were so convincing. They were so convincing that people believed them, except the people who were actually being accused. And they're going, no, I don't know anything about this. I am innocent. So this pink place, and I have a handout because I like some of these slides. And that pink thing is when they started accusing people and they end up incarcerated. That's about 3 months. Nobody was tried. That's because there was a change coming. The new governor was arriving at the end of May, and they were going to have the court system. And I think probably out of deference to him coming, they just kept putting people in jail and said, well, we'll deal with this when the governor gets here. By the end of that 3-month period, you've got at least half of the people, almost half of the people who would ultimately be accused. So 70 people were in custody before they started having the trials. Now this red area, that was when they had the trials in 1692. Notice that the red goes a little bit farther, because these four pieces, that's when they had the trials. And it goes a little bit farther. They had a big debate as to whether they were going to have another one. And they decided, it's getting kind of cold, and so they waited until 1693. And then in January of 1693, that's when the brand new Superior Court of Judicature was created in Massachusetts. And right now, the Supreme Court of Judicature in Massachusetts, they consider that the first seating of the court, even the one today. So if you hear stories about people saying, oh, in the fall of 1692, the governor's wife got accused and he just shut the whole thing down and everybody went home. No. We have no concrete evidence, just anecdotal evidence that maybe somebody mentioned her name. But they were getting ready to keep going. And every case, no matter where it was in 1692, if you were in jail, you stayed in jail. If you had been indicted, you stood indicted, and they started hearing the cases from then on. They processed everybody. Everybody. It was not a big get-out-of-jail-free card. As a matter of fact, one of the women who was found not guilty in 1693 died in jail because she didn't have money to pay her jailer's fees. So it would be nice if it was just sort of like somebody had all this sense. The governor was just knew what was going on and he was going to clean it up. That's not the way it happened. Here, another timeline. I love timelines. This one has a peak for every day of that period through 1692. And each one, I've got them sort of color-coded. That's because I wanted to separate out the ones from Salem Village and Salem itself. So Salem Village, they're all the yellow ones. The green ones are Salem Town. And the black ones are just every other town, because remember all those other towns, just having to color code them, when there might be one. So, and then if you look past July, red, that's what we have in Andover. So you notice that we don't really have much from Salem on that side, and we don't have much from Andover on this side. 2 waves of accusations. And beginning of June is when the courts started hearing cases. So they started hearing cases in June. There was a little lull, and then they were back at it with a vengeance. A third of the people who were accused were from Andover, and most of those people confessed. So people say, why isn't it the Andover witchcraft trials? I said, because the trials took place in Salem. Yes, question in the back.
So I've never heard the distinction between Salem Village and Salem Town. Now, I've only ever heard Salem.
Okay. The question is, she's only heard Salem and not Salem Village and Salem Town. There was also Salem Farms. These are different areas of Salem because Salem was a pretty big town, acreage-wise. But the town was the port, and Salem Village and Salem Farms were more the agrarian areas of them. And Salem Village really wanted to have its own minister so that people didn't have to go all the way into Salem Town for meetings. So that was one of the pressures that was on because they wanted to ordain their own minister. And a congregation could pick their own minister and ordain them, but that would mean taking some people away from the church in Salem town. So they had to agree to it. It took a while, but they finally did for Samuel Parris. But all these things, you're starting to see the towns coming apart into small places.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So now here in November, you got 3 over here. Anybody see the first season of Who Do You Think You Are? Sarah Jessica Parker. Yes, Sarah Jessica Parker. They're saying, yes, and she's descended from one of the last women accused of witchcraft in the Salem witchcraft trials. I said, well, it's one of those Gloucester women. Nothing ever really happened to them, but they were accused in November. Nothing happened to them. But you see all these people that were accused from Andover. I'm popular in Andover because I'll talk about them. Most people want to hear about Salem Village. So let's get to the manuscripts. Now I've got some facsimiles floating around. These are all the different things that I'll be talking about. So if you want to see any of them, this one, we go from the accusations. The girls are making crazy sounds and being convulsed and things like that. But it took something else to make it go toward prosecuting them, and that is somebody had to make a complaint. And this particular complaint starts at the top. It complains to the authorities that Rebecca Nurse had afflicted these kids. So in addition to the complaint, we get in this thing, and this is to the sheriff saying, you are therefore ordered to bring her to us on a particular day and time so that they could examine her. And here we've got the two local magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. Now, local magistrates were the justices of the peace. They were the ones that trying to get people to get along. You know, you could have an argument with your neighbor and stuff like that, and finally they say, you're going to go in there. You wanted to sue somebody for slander, some little thing. Somebody didn't pay me back. Those are the local magistrates who do this. And this is where it starts, with the local magistrates taking complaints. So they order the sheriff to go and arrest her and bring her in. And this part at the bottom is what he said, I have done what you've asked. Sometimes they couldn't find people. And that was troublesome too. So when they were brought in, basically they were interrogated. You know, sort of like Lenny Briscoe in the box in Law and Order, except that it was in public. They did this in the meeting house, and this is very strange. They probably shouldn't have been doing it that way. Because all these people were watching and commenting, and I'm sure it was just very raucous in the meeting house. But the 2 magistrates had the accused person come up, and they interrogated them. Now, they'll call them examinations, but it's an interrogation with an audience. This particular piece is 1 page from a 4-page document that takes down what was happening during the examination of Martha Corey. Now, she was about 80 years old, and she had a lot to say. But if you take a look at some of this, we're zooming in, it reads like drama, and there's a reason why Arthur Miller poached from it. You could actually find lines in Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, that came right out of some of these. So she's there, and he starts asking a question. Tell me now why you hurt these persons. Well, okay, 1, it assumes that these persons are being hurt by specters, and 2, that she has done it. So it's a leading question. So what does she say? I do not. You know, good. Then who doth? He's still intent that these girls are afflicted and somebody's doing it. Now, what do you say at that point? Well, she says, pray, give me leave to go to prayer. She's trying to show, hey, I have none of this, I want to pray. And they say, we do not send you to go to prayer, but tell me why you hurt these. Still back, why did you hurt these people? And she says, I am an innocent woman. I had never had to do with witchcraft my entire life. She's just protesting this. Now, one of the things that's really remarkable in this is that it's all being taken down. And we hear her expressing her innocence and all that. We don't usually get that in documents. Usually you want to wait for the confession, because the confession is the gold standard to convict somebody. So we have in all these documents, we have all these attempts to convince people that they are not guilty, that they are innocent. And actually in those days, if you accused somebody of something, you had to reply. You didn't have the right to remain silent in those days. If you didn't reply, that was sort of like, okay, I guess they did it. So, this is Reverend Paris. I went to see this. It's at the Mass Historical Society. And I said, can I come see this painting? You know, I'm imagining something, I mean, not quite that big. And I get in there, and the guy came out with a little teeny box and the white gloves, you know, and he opened it up, and he's sitting there while I'm looking at this thing that's this big. And it's just like, okay, could you turn it over? You know, it was really weird. I thought it was a painting I could stand in front of and contemplate. But no, it's about this big, and it looks like it was some kind of, had a hinge on it, so it's some kind of jewelry. We know who it came from, so the provenance tells us this is Samuel Paris. Samuel Paris, a lot of people want to portray him as the bad guy, because he wrote all those things, and stuff started in his house, and he was pretty intent on pursuing things. But you think about it. Young minister, you think Satan's coming after all of New England. And then not just New England and the church in New England. It's his town. It's his church. It's his parsonage. It's his family. So I got to give the guy a little slack. He's looking at this as a personal assault from Satan, not just this general thing that the other ministers are talking about. This is coming home. So I got to give him a little bit of slack on this. So let's keep going. Once you had been examined, those local magistrates could decide to let you go and say, oh, I don't think so. Or they could say, okay, well, we kind of think so, but we're going to let you out on bail. Let you out on bail for about £100. And we'll tell you when to come in for your trial. But then they could keep you. And one of the amazing things with the Salem trials is they kept everybody. And they didn't let anybody out on bail. It's like, oh, well, actually, there was one person that they let go after they examined him. A young guy, Nehemiah Abbott Jr., he was about 19 years old. And he came in, and they described what he looked like. And they said he had a wen on his forehead. Anybody a crossword puzzle Scrabble person? You know the word wen? It means a bump. Yes. Yeah. So 19 years old. So they brushed his hair away from his forehead. I guess the acne had cleared up. So they said, well, you described him as having a wen on his forehead, so nope, this can't be him. After that, the girls wised up. They didn't describe people. No, they did a little bit of that. But then they said, well, how do you know it was this particular person? How do you know it was Goody Carrier? How did you know it was Susanna Martin? Oh, she told us. She said her name was Goody North, and she was from Amesbury, and just, I'm going, oh, that's really interesting. That's like, you know, going to rob a bank and say, oh, could you deposit it in my account? So like, why would they even say these things? So they switched around, and everybody else stayed in jail. Now, once you're in jail, you might get transferred to another place. So this particular one is for bringing a bunch of people from Boston back to Salem. So they were moving them from prison to prison. And this is a minimus, which is the official paper that gives the sheriff authority to take a prisoner from one location and put them into the custody of somebody else. So this is May 25th, so they're starting to get ready for the trials, and they're bringing in Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse, even Dorothy Good. Dorothy Good was Sarah Good's child. She was about 4 or 5 years old, and they got her to confess, surprise, surprise. A couple of old men trying to ask this little girl, you know, well, did your mom do any of this stuff? Oh, yes, she gave me a little bird. You know, they got a 4-year-old to confess to witchcraft. They sent her to jail. Yeah. Coercion was huge. If you think about finding out that Tituba confessed, you find out a 4-year-old confessed. You find people that had mental issues. They confessed, and that, remember I said, that's the gold standard. They were getting really good at coercing false confessions. So here they are, they're moving around. Then we got our same 2 guys. They're doing this. Now, in this, we actually have some really interesting documents, and this is a jailer's bill for all the things that were going on with all these people in jail. So the chains for Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, 14 shillings. Because we even have blacksmith's bills for these things. 2 blankets for Sarah Good's child, 10 shillings. Little Dorothy. Shackles for 10 prisoners, 2 pounds. And then all the rest of these, it's really interesting because they have all the different people and how many weeks' diet they were charged. So a week's diet was 2 shillings 6 pence. And one of the cool things about a document like this is it keeps track of that because they want to get money back, but you can also find out when if you're going for an individual person, when they went in and when they went out. If you're looking at a particular person, like your ancestor or just somebody whose case really grabs you, this helps you do a timeline for an individual person. And as I said, there are all sorts of other bills for what this took. So let's pop out of Salem and let's come up here to New Hampshire. Just so you know, we never hanged anybody here in New Hampshire. We had our share of accusations, but we never hanged anybody. But over in Hampton, ooh, they seem to have a big breakout. This is a document from a case in 1673 of Eunice Cole. Essentially, Eunice Cole was the neighbor from hell. She was getting hauled into before the authorities for screaming at people, and just one of those people. So this was one of the times that she was brought in, but she came in a bunch of times. We start seeing her in the legal records about 1640. She started to be accused of witchcraft in 1656. Notice she's still alive after that. So we got 1673 and then again in 1680. Around that time she passed away. So she's got quite a timeline. But we'll get back to her in a little bit. But we're having other things going on. Also in 1680, there we go, Rachel Fuller over in Hampton was also accused. Oh, goodness. Well, she wasn't really doing things that would keep her seeming innocent. Apparently the next door neighbors had a little baby, 1-year-old Moses, and she was just too inquisitive, asking all sorts of questions. And this is a deposition. This woman, Elizabeth Denham, went and could say, yes, I heard these things about her. And if you wanted to give testimony against somebody, you had to write it down. So we have all these particular things. Now, she doesn't actually come out and say she was a witch, but said she was just too interested in why this little kid was sick. And then she started calling her own baby Moses. And so this is all just sort of a little wrong stuff. But they actually let her out on bail, on 100 pounds bail. And you see other things in here. There was sworn. There was a grand jury. They had the grand jury system the same way we do. You know, they have a grand jury impaneled, and they show them the evidence and said, do you think this is enough evidence to try somebody? And they say either, yes, we find it a true bill, or we don't know. And the word for that on the back of these documents is ignoramus. So, and then here we've actually got a trial. She didn't get convicted. Yay. It's a little weird, but let's go back to Salem. This particular document is an account from Mary Walcott, one of those teenagers who was making accusations. And this one is against John Willard. Just so you know, about 25% of all witchcraft accusations are against men. Usually it's the spouse of a woman who's accused, but in this case, no. But these teenage girls were making accusations, and you can read some of it. There's Mary Walcott, and she's the apparition, it's always afflicting them. But notice, it's a really good projector. Do you notice that there are 2 different colors of ink? Sort of right there. Yeah. The first time you see it on these documents, and really seeing the documents in person can be really, really helpful. But it's sort of like, oh, did he run out of ink? New batch, because they were making their own ink. So you look at that and go, okay. We found 17 documents in this person's handwriting. This is Thomas Putnam, who was the father of one of the accusing girls. And they all have this change of ink. And it also starts also on the 18th of May, being the day of his examination. I was most grievously tortured. Excuse me. I come prepared. Talking too much. Masks are nice and humid. Long class. Okay, so why would this be the case? And this ink change appears on 17 different ones that Thomas Putnam wrote. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. It's the indictments. That was added to support the indictment because you see again, good projector. You see a sort of an orangey thing? If you've done anything with lawyers, you know that it's all fill in the blanks, right? Even then, they had official scribes who would make the boilerplate by hand and leave spaces. You can see little lines in here to fill in the spaces. Yeah, well, in almost every single case, the crime they were accused of perpetrating, was done from the day they were examined. Excuse me. So they were being tried on what they did during their examination. I'm very sorry. This is one of my favorite parts, and here I am. Okay. So you could have said, oh, he afflicted me back in March, but nobody's being tried on what they claim happened in March. It's all the day of their examination. Why? Because there are witnesses. Have lots of witnesses. There are 4 of these in the case of Rebecca Nurse. They just have different people filled in. Okay. For evidence against people, if you'd been in trouble before, Eunice Cole, they would pull that stuff out, and they would make copies and send that to the court. So if you'd been in trouble before, like Bridget Bishop and Susanna Martin, they would pull that stuff out. So that's why we get the 1656 stuff on our friend Eunice Cole. They would also be looking for witches' teats. Now, this particular painting is not from 1692. It's from 1853. In the 19th century, there was a lot of romanticization of our history. We're trying to tell our origin stories, and boy, weren't they superstitious back then. We know better. But this is showing, this old lady is saying, look, she's got a mole right there. The idea was that the devil would issue the witch a familiar. Now, we think about black cats, right? But he could give her a familiar that was just about anything. It could be a bird, it could be a snake, it could be a turtle, it could be puppies. If you look at all the evidence of people saying, yes, I heard something, but there was also a place on their body that apparently these familiars would suckle her blood. So they're always looking for them. Now, I'm sorry, these are people from the British Isles. If you don't think they didn't have warts and moles and skin tags and scars and all sorts of things, you could probably find something on everybody in this room. I don't want to. I don't want to. I leave that to your dermatologist. Oh, my. Yeah, that's a little intimate, but they were intimate. They were intimate. They were looking at these people from stem to stern, as it were. You get my drift? Yeah. One of the things that I found really interesting when I was starting into this research was there was a description of the private parts of my ancestor. I said, why is there a description of these? Well, part of it was that she was claiming that it wasn't midwives that were examining them, that the women examining them, and it was a panel of women and a doctor, and she said none of those women are a midwife. They don't know what they're looking at. Now, it could very well be that she had tearing and scarring. She could have had a prolapsed uterus, all these normal things. She'd given birth to 8 kids. But she said, you need a midwife. Don't just look at it and say, yeah, well, that looks like a teat to me. And they also did not do it in public. This makes it, oh, look, everybody's looking. He's just horrified. Somebody's fainted over there. No, they took them aside separately, and they examined the men with a jury of men, and the women with a jury of women. And it's a jury of inquest, finders of fact. and they would answer the question, did this person have a witch's teat? And they would say, yes, they did, because they always found something. Some of the other cases, somebody claimed, not in Salem, but somebody claimed to be up in the gallery, and when this guy yawned, they saw a teat inside his mouth. I don't know. So these are the examinations, some of the results. They did a whole bunch of them at once, and then they turn it in. And this is the doctor at the bottom signing off on it. But it was women examining women. They were also looking for examples of things that you might have done that were like white witchcraft, because white witchcraft was still witchcraft. And reading palms was a big one, telling fortunes. This is not a book from the Salem trials, but it's early enough that there could have been books like this one, or even this one, in New England, because they brought lots of things over from England. And one of the cases against Dorcas Hoare is it was said that 20 years earlier she had a book of palms reading, and her minister told her to get rid of it, and she did. Too bad, they still remembered she'd had one. So your reputation would follow you. Also, Samuel Wardwell supposedly would read palms. He'd look at the palm and ponder, and then tell people, oh, your wife's going to have 7 girls before she has a boy. Things like that. You shouldn't be doing that, because that'll get you into trouble. So they were looking for evidence that people were doing that. Horoscopes, too. We don't think, oh, they did horoscopes back then? Of course they did. Now, this is a different kind of finders of fact. This is a coroner's jury. And remember little baby Moses? He didn't make it. So in this case, you've got a doctor and a jury of men looking at the poor little kid's body. And they concluded, remember, they're finders of fact, we found grounds of suspicion that the child was murdered by witchcraft. They don't have to say what they saw. They just are finders of fact. How did this kid die? Because they had coroner's inquests all the time. Did this person drown? If they had a dead body and there's no water coming out of the lungs, well, the body was in the water, but it didn't drown. They had an understanding about how bodies worked. So it was fairly common to do these, but I don't know what they were looking at that made them conclude this was because of witchcraft. It was accepted, though. Now, you may have heard of ducking a witch, where you put them into water. And if they float, they're guilty. If they sink, they're innocent. You heard that one? They didn't do that in Salem. As a matter of fact, Cotton Mather and his father, Increase Mather, really said, the whole premise of that is wrong. Because if it's just water, that just doesn't work. It was supposedly that the water was pure and they would reject the witches. And it's just, they said, we don't go for that one. However, in Connecticut that winter, here we go. It was in September. 2 women were ducked in Connecticut. That's 1692, in September of 1692. And the testimony from these guys, there we go. She buoyed up like a cork. She swam upon the water. Oops. Elizabeth Clausen was found not guilty despite failing this test. Mercy Desborough was found guilty, but then in Connecticut they didn't rush to judgment, and they ended up pardoning her. On all of these, we don't have the record book for the trials from that court of Oyer and Terminer. It was just sort of put into place to handle these. We don't have the record book, and some people say, oh, maybe they didn't have one. No. All the courts had record books. They were really big on precedent, and they wanted to keep track of everything that had happened. Number 2, maybe they were so embarrassed they destroyed it. No. It was probably used so much later on when people were appealing and trying to reverse the attainder. So they'd had to gone to the court clerk and get copies of things. So the fact that we don't have one for that court in the summer of 1692 is really predictable. Maybe we would have had it, but we wouldn't have that much more information. This is the first page of the book for the Superior Court of Judicature that came in January of 1693. And you don't get a whole lot of extra stuff in there. Essentially, it says who's on the grand jury, who's on the jury of trials, and then it repeats what's in the indictment, what the actual charge is, and then at the bottom it says whether they were found guilty or not guilty. And if they were found not guilty, they would be released upon paying their jailer's fees. Lydia Dustin couldn't do it, died in jail, or they were found guilty. Now, in January of 1693, they found 3 more women guilty, and they were going to hang them too. So if you say, oh, well, they didn't, nobody else was convicted after the fall of 1692, no, we have evidence that they were actually found guilty. So that's really all you'll find from this book. There's not a whole lot of extra, because those documents we have were all signed with sworn for being in the grand jury. They were signed for being in court. We have more detail with all the documents we have. Now, I like this particular one. Poor Eunice Cole. This is the results, the verdict in her case in 1673. Not legally guilty according to the indictment. So if there was a particular crime, they have to outline when did it happen, who happened, all that stuff. They say, well, not legally guilty, but just ground of vehement suspicion of having familiarity with the devil. Yeah, so they just kept her locked up. Or they sent her home. I mean, they banished her from Hampton and she didn't go. They had her on house arrest. It was pretty awful. But she was the kind of person, she was the neighbor from hell. Nobody wanted her, but she wouldn't go away. If you were found guilty, of course, in Salem, you were set to be executed. This is the warrant for the execution of Bridget Bishop. And you see this right here, that's the wax seal of the chief magistrate. And the bulk of it describes what the crimes were, what she was indicted for, that she was found guilty, and it's an order to the sheriff to bring her to the place of execution on a particular date and time and hang her by the neck until she was dead. It's stated in there exactly what the order was. And down here, took the paper back, the sheriff said, I have taken Bridget Bishop to this particular date, time, place, and I have hanged her by the neck until she was dead. If you go down to Salem now, they have a new memorial, because a bunch of my friends got together and said, okay, everybody wants to know where the hangings took place. We all know. I mean, when they made a press release, they made it sound like we just discovered this, but those of us who've been studying it for a while all knew where it was. But it turns out it was right on a piece of land that Salem already owned. So it's like, good, they now made a park. It was really terrible piece of land. I mean, there was a broken old toilet, all sorts of stuff. It was just, people had dumped things there. But a couple of years ago, they made this this particular memorial at Proctor's Ledge. And so if you're down there and you want to see that, there's a second place you can go. This is William Stoughton. He was the chief magistrate. That was his signature at the bottom and his wax seal on that. I am working on a biography of him. He's a really tough nut to crack. Never married, never had any kids. There's no cache somewhere of his letters and papers and diaries. No, none of that. We do know he's very generous with Harvard. That is a building that he gave 1,000 pounds to Harvard to build. It's a dormitory. It was built in, well, he started in groundbreaking in 1697, 1698. 1,000 pounds. Now, if there's anybody that's responsible, aside from those two guys, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, who didn't let anybody go, the ones that believed all these things, this is the guy that was signing the death warrants. He really was going after all of those things, and he even wrote more death warrants in January to get those 3 women and a couple of others that had sort of gone through the, no, one of them had been pregnant. They wouldn't hang you if you were pregnant. So there was another warrant for the execution of people in January of 1692. And that's where the governor came in and said, you know what, we're not going to execute anybody else. And the letter that the governor wrote back to the Crown said, and the chief magistrate refused to return to the bench for the next sitting. So he had a little hissy fit. At some point I will have a whole lot more to say about him. He's fascinating. And even if you think somebody's the bad guy, once you start looking at anybody closely enough, they're fascinating. They're absolutely fascinating. And I'm convinced that if he hadn't been the chief magistrate of these trials and signed those death warrants, he would be lost to history. A few little things, like the town of Stoughton's named after him, and there's still a Stoughton Hall, not that one, at Harvard. But he really would have been lost to history because there's not a whole lot of stuff about him. Whereas somebody like Samuel Sewell, he left diaries, he left papers, all sorts of things. He has a big family, and they all saved his stuff. But this is the main thing that we'll know Stoughton for, is Stoughton Hall. I've been examining this painting. It's at Harvard. And I think they added the Stoughton Hall after, because there's a whole stretch here that's just all redone. So I think they started the painting before he gave Stoughton Hall, and then they added it in. Well, that was a big donation. Remember I said they weren't letting people out on bail? Well, finally, in October, they started letting some kids out on bail. Now, this particular one, to get these kids out, Stephen Johnson was 13, Abigail Johnson was 10, and Sarah Carrier was 8, and they were in jail. So, you see 3 little things down here. Those are the wax seals of those people. They had to put up value to get these kids out. Now, remember when I got Rachel Fuller, she was out on 100 pounds bail? Yeah. I think the people in Andover, because they're all from Andover, said, what's it going to take? These are our kids. We can't leave them in jail. It's October. It's getting cold. They released them on 500 pounds of bail per kid. They actually bailed out 8 little kids. 500 pounds. And just the only thing I can imagine is they say, okay, what's it going to take? Okay, 500 pounds, and they got the largest landowner and the fathers of these kids to say, yes, we will make sure that they show up. But yeah, by the time you get to December, the bail was back to regular 100 pounds, for kids 50 pounds. But remember I said that whole building at Harvard was 1,000 pounds? So that gives you an idea of the scope of it. We know more about Samuel Sewell because, as I said, bigger family, he kept diaries, he had papers, he lived longer, he was just, I think he had a couple of wives. I mean, just really interesting guy. Now, when we look at this picture, he looks like this jowly old judge, doesn't he? Yeah, he was 40 at the time of the Salem witchcraft trials. And he was the most junior member of the bench. Stoughton was 60. Stoughton was a big deal. He, when it came to the fast day in 1696, actually apologized. And you'll hear this, that the Stools apologized. He desired to take the blame and the shame of all of it. Then people say, Stoughton never apologized. It's sort of like, oh, God. Just because something's missing doesn't mean it means anything, So, in this case, eventually they started saying, we need some changes. When you were convicted, there was a time between being convicted, sentenced, and executed. Now, some people were sentenced but never executed because the governor stepped in. Once you were sentenced, something called attainder attached, the tainting of the blood. You were dead as far as the court and the law was concerned. Your civil rights ended. So you could be convicted, nothing happens. Sentenced, something changes. And then they wouldn't kill you for about 3 or 4 days after sentencing. But you were dead in the eyes of the law. Well, the problem is there were a bunch of people who were convicted, and the attainder didn't go away. So here we are 10 years later, and these women are going, this is starting to be a problem, because if you are standing convicted and all that, somebody else just has to say, hey, I really think she's a witch, and, on the record, remember precedent? So we start getting people trying to get the attainder reversed, and we start in Andover. Eventually they did. They got just about everybody, although you'll be hearing something about Elizabeth Johnson Jr. She was one of the people that was convicted in January. You might hear something about She was never mentioned in any of these things. So I think the kids in Andover, Massachusetts have been pushing this to get that done by the state. We also had people that were saying, excuse me, I lost some stuff. You may hear people say, oh, people accuse their neighbors so they could grab their land. No. Women didn't own land to begin with, unless they were widows. So that really doesn't work. But what was seized by the sheriff in the name of the crown was all your movable goods. So all the stuff in your house, in your barn, in your fields, all that stuff, the sheriff would come and seize and then sell it off for the crown. If you were lucky, one of your neighbors would go, oh, wait, how much you want for that? And get it. But in some cases, you didn't. So this is the Wardwells in Andover, and you can see all the stuff they've got there. Actually, this is my favorite one. 5 cows, heifer and a calf, horse, 9 pigs, all the hay. Took all the hay out of the barn. Took all of his carpentry tools. Now, this is an illustration by Eric Sloan, if you like those books. I mean, but hand tools for carpentry really haven't changed a whole lot in centuries. But just grabbing all his carpentry tools, took the corn that was in the field. And you know that it was right around September. That's when this guy was being accused, because that's when all the corn disappears. So we got all this stuff. Now, why were they asking for it? Because once you were sentenced, they could come in and take your stuff. So they did. So in the compensation part, a lot of people were asking for, the fee to get a copy of my case from the clerk, and we had to have several trips to Boston to see my mother in jail. But if you see the big numbers, it's that they came and took their stuff. And you only find this for men and widows. And then we get to this. William Good, husband of Sarah Good, who was executed. And they asked him, so, what did you lose? Let's take a look. So my wife, Sarah Good, was in prison above 4 months and executed. A sucking child. Oh, did I not mention that? A sucking child died in prison before the mother's execution. She was breastfeeding. A child of 4 or 5 years old was in prison above 7 to 8 months, and being chained and so hardly used, she hath ever since been very chargeable with no reason to govern herself. He said, I leave it to the honorable court to judge what the damages were. Now, I know I like a whole lot of this stuff. I think it's kind of fun to tease things out. And I don't like ending on a down note, but this is the damage. I mean, people like going down to haunted happenings in Salem. They like it, it's fun. But for me, this kind of devastation to a whole family is at the heart of it. So I sometimes have a hard time finding people, with their Slurpees sitting in the memorials. Sort of like, do you have any idea what really happened? So he left it to the judges, and they said, okay, how about 30 pounds? 30 pounds. So you can't really put a price on those things, can you? No. So he got less than the Wardwells did for all their stuff that they took. So, here we are on a down note. But I find this all very fascinating, and thank you all for coming out tonight for this. And I'm happy to take questions. Sorry, I left on a down note, but and this is Stoughton's seal. So, any questions? Oh, come on! This is my favorite part. Yes, question.
What is your explanation for this lunacy? What was happening in society that perpetuated this whole thing?
Well, in general, people are mean to each other. Neighbors don't get along. Things like that. There is no single silver bullet. There was a lot of social and political anxiety. There was a lot of stuff going on the frontier like we saw in York. So there were a lot of people who were nervous about that. Some of the people who were making accusations were from those areas in Maine. So they were all these refugees were coming in from Maine into areas like Salem. The same things that can happen in regular times, if you have the law taking those things seriously and going after people, that's a huge problem. They weren't getting people to come up with peaceable resolutions. So don't know why. We don't know why Hathorne and Corwin did what they did. If they had acted differently, if they'd been a little more skeptical. Now, anybody can accuse anybody else. I mean, one of the questions that I ask is, why did the Salem witchcraft trials take place in Salem? Sounds like a dumb question, I suppose. Because up until that point, all capital cases were heard in Boston. But one of the things that came with the charter was that they said, okay, we're going to have those superior courts in all the different places, all the county court things. So they ended up doing those things locally. And you know, there's a reason why we have a change of venue. Because if it's locally, everybody will come forward. So there was a decision there to do them locally, which, you know, people say, sure, I'll come by. Whereas we have other cases, Elizabeth Morse in 1680, and their bills that the witnesses submitted for what it took them to get from their town to get down to Boston and back. So it cost a lot of money to bring in witnesses. So by having it in Salem, everybody was right there. And you know, the change of venue would have helped. I wish I had a single bullet, but for every single accusation, there's a separate story. And when you have 151 people being accused, that's 151 stories. That's why some people only like those 5. We know about Tituba. We know that story. Let's see, if you like the story about the frontier and what was happening in King William's War, I recommend Mary Beth Norton's book, In the Devil's Snare. That's really a superb one. It's on the handout. So I wish I had a silver bullet. Perfect storm. Yep.
Did anything ever happen to the girls who started the accusations? Were they ever held accountable for their craziness?
Okay, were the girls ever held accountable for what they did? Actually, no. As a matter of fact, we find that Ann Putnam Jr., one of the teenagers, years later wanted to join the church in Salem Village, different minister. And she said, yeah, I accused people wrongly. And it was her profession of faith and her own confession, and she was accepted by the church. She said she accused innocent people. Beyond that, we don't know what happened to Abigail Williams. There's no trace of her before. Here she is 10 years old. There's no trace of her before, and there's no trace of her after. And they say that she was either Samuel Parrot's kin or niece. I think for them, just having the 2 different generations could make her a niece. But somehow she was related to him. Well, we know who his family is. We know his wife's family. We have never found any connection to Abigail Williams. And if you read The Crucible, you know, they'll say something about, well, she went on to be a prostitute and stuff like that. No, I mean, they were young girls. They were maidservants, and they sort of disappear into the woodwork. Paris's daughter, Betty, got married. We know a little bit more about her, but, you know, there wasn't accountability, although continually, and Mary Beth Norton said this recently, said, why are we so fascinated with those girls? Why are we so fascinated by them? Why are they the ones that are the ones to blame and should be held accountable? And I don't know. That's an interesting question. Why do we think they're accountable? Yep.
What ended all the accusations and trials? Did it just kind of blow away? Did people
Well,
lose interest?
as we got into October, November, that area, they weren't really taking all of those accusations as seriously. That's why we got those 3 in Gloucester. And nothing really happened to them. People were losing a little of the fervor that they were doing. So, anybody else? Question?
like this doesn't happen and then the community just picks up and moves on. I mean, this is from a social perspective, this is hugely traumatic in a small community. And I'm wondering if there's any information about how the community itself moved on, how they recovered, or were there any other, you know, social dynamics that were going on as a result of all of this?
Okay. So the question is, how did the community move on after this horrific event? Is that about it?
More or less.
Yeah. I'm trying to do it for other people. Well, some people moved to Framingham. Former Governor Danforth had a lot of land there, and we know that there's a house that belonged to Sarah Cloyce and her husband. Sarah Cloyce was Rebecca Nurse's sister. But a lot of people did move away. But just the way it is with generations, you know, the people that were at odds the most, the kids don't really remember that. And there was a lot of intermarrying again, and within another generation or two, you were finding people on both sides of the accusations, their kids and grandchildren are marrying. Because places were kind of small, and next generation doesn't remember all that stuff. The heart wants what the heart wants. And it took a while, these 20 years before they got everybody's attainder reversed and the compensation out. That took a while. But that's about a generation, isn't it? So, yep.
May I ask, what did you, how long have you been, when did you write this book?
Okay, this book,
Yeah.
Records of the Salem Witch Hunt. I started developing an interest in this when I was in a graduate program in historical linguistics at the University of Southern California in the fall of '93, spring of '94. And I dropped out of my doctoral program, and I came home, back to New England, and I said, you know, I should probably write up about that Rebecca Nurse, because I think she's in my family. I'll write up something for my parents, my brother. 1994. I still haven't done it. But because I was starting to get really interested, and I just consume everything, I was asked by Bernie Rosenthal at one point to help make this book. He had discovered that existing transcriptions had problems. And one of them had caught him. And he had published something that was, oops, wrong. There was a date that was in there that said that Tituba, the grand jury, had let her off in May of 1692. And he's trying to figure out, why did they do something different for her? All right, well, okay. Well, it turns out it was 1693. It was a bad transcription. And there were a lot of other errors. So he wanted to do an edition that would correct all the errors. It was going to take 2 or 3 years.
Is that Bernie Rosenthal?
Yes.
Esquire?
No.
No.
He was an English professor at Binghamton University, and his specialty was Melville.
Is that what you wanted to do?
This?
When you went to school? I mean, okay, so you're.
Well, let me tell this a little bit more on the story of this, because I'll finish it.
Okay.
We got several grants. This book, which is the size of a ream of paper with covers on it, it took 12 of us 10 years to go through all of the individual documents, handwritten documents, and transcribe them in painstaking detail. We dated everything and put it in chronological order, wrote all sorts of notes, and whose handwriting, we identified whose handwriting was on the documents. This was nothing I ever majored in. I was an English major. And there was Bernie, who was an English professor. But the program that I'd been in California was in linguistics. And half of our team were linguists from Scandinavia, no joke. Most of them were from Finland. We had another one from Sweden. And they were really good at old documents. Paleography. I mean, if you look at those documents, you go, what is that? So we spent a lot of time to produce that. And I was the project manager, which means everything that anybody did came through me. And I was also an editor. It was a lot of work. But we got several grants to do it. And then when it was over, I mean, I had this book, and I went, is that it? After a decade? 12 of us working on this thing? It's a ream of paper? But it is right now the standard for anything people working on Salem. This is the Bible of all that. So now you had another question. My background?
Yes.
I went to school for
Yes.
it. I was an English major,
Okay.
which basically, if you want to go into the law or any of these things, being an English major is a really good thing to do because you learn how to do close examination of texts. And you can ask questions of it. So did that, have a master's in linguistics from UNH, and I have a master's in fiction writing, which I say I have a master's in making up stuff. But this I didn't make up.
And you're a resident of New Hampshire?
Yes, I live in Manchester.
Oh, very nice.
7th generation New Hampshire.
Very nice.
So anyway, other question. Yep.
Are you familiar with the story of Mary Eastie at all? And
Oh, yes.
Farm? Because
She's-
I've been there recently since it's been restored, and I'm actually getting married there this summer.
Oh, cool.
The history is really interesting to me about Mary Eastie being Rebecca Nurse's sister.
Yes, the question is about Mary Eastie. Actually, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Cloyce, and Mary Eastie were the Town sisters. They were all related, and all three of them were accused. Mary Eastie's case is very interesting because they sent her to jail and then briefly let her come back because the girls were saying, well, maybe it wasn't her, and then they let her, and then good old Mercy Lewis. Mercy Lewis was going, no, I think she's afflicting me, and they came and got her again. And also, after she'd been convicted, she wrote a really incredible petition to the court saying, look, and I know I'm going to die. I know I'm going to die. But could you look at those confessors? Because there are a lot of people confessing that. Again, gold standard. Could you look at them, and could you look at them a little bit more? Because I don't think they really are. I think something's going on. And yes, she was executed, but maybe it helped. You would see that she's more one of the heroes of this, saying, you know, don't trust everything, you know. And I don't know why she would say, yeah, I know I'm going to die. I guess she sort of figured that the process was the process, and she was not going to be able to get out of it. And Sarah Cloyce, the other sister, she was very lucky because in September, they couldn't get all the witnesses to come in for her grand jury. One of them was her sister-in-law. And the sister-in-law was being called in, and her nieces and nephews, and they said, no, we can't come. And the court was not happy. Oh, no, we're sick. We can't get there. So they put off her grand jury until January. And then nobody showed up, and they didn't pursue anybody who didn't show up. So all three of the indictments against Sarah Cloyce were found ignoramus. So three very different stories for the three different sisters. So, I mean, Sarah, when Rebecca Nurse was accused, she never would have been accused on other circumstances. She was a fully covenanted member of her church. That means she would have gone through a whole process with the congregation and the minister and all these things, a profession of faith. She was actually fully covenanted in Salem town. Martha Corey was fully covenanted in Salem village. There's no reason why those two women would have been the usual suspects. Or Mary Eastie either. So, anyway, anybody else? Yeah, okay.
Just one quick question. I'm just curious here because I look around and I see that we're almost all women here tonight. And I'm interested in this just because I feel like it's a particularly important record in gender history.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering when you give this talk if you are normally presenting to audiences that are largely women.
Yes, she's asking about whether I usually present to audiences that are largely women. Yes, but also I have another talk on the history of animation, and those audiences are also mostly women. I think, I go, okay, Walt Disney. So I don't know that it necessarily means anything. I know that this particular series with the New Hampshire Humanities Council tends to bring out, at least for the ones I'm at, a lot more women, but that may not be the case for other presenters. I spoke at the British Library. I was part of part of the programming for the Harry Potter exhibit that they had just started. And that audience was pretty 50-50. So it was great fun. So is that it? I'm happy to take questions in person later, but I hope you like seeing the facsimiles, and I thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Oh, it was great.